The last key idea of Keynes in chapter 11 is called the Paradox of Thrift. In the book, this is kind of towards the end. It's in chapter 11, it's section 3C. But it's an idea of Keynes that kind of follows along, or in some ways it's a reverse of his idea of the marginal propensity to consume. So, what does it mean? Well, so Keynes was really big on the idea of the marginal propensity to consume increasing aggregate demand as a result of government spending, right? So if government spends money, today we will call this stimulus spending, right? If government spends money, that money becomes income for people who get the money from government. They turn around, they spend it on stuff, that money becomes income and so forth, okay? So this idea of Keynes of the marginal propensity to consume and the expenditure multiplier was part of his idea that, look, government could increase spending by a certain amount, but the overall increase in aggregate demand would be larger, i.e. the expenditure multiplier. It would be larger by, say, 5 times or 10 times or whatever the marginal propensity to consume, whatever it led to, that type of multiplier. So that's his idea of the expenditure multiplier, okay? His idea of the paradox of thrift is kind of the opposite of that. And what Keynes was arguing is that, look, when the economy starts to go into a recession, it's very natural for people to become worried about the future, obviously, and they start to save, right? And so Keynes was arguing that that tendency was bad. So the idea of thrift, that is savings, he was saying it's actually, in Keynes's view, he was arguing it's not as helpful for the economy. And here's why. If I save more, that means I'm not spending as much. Okay, so therefore, aggregate demand is probably going to decline, right? And given that I'm not spending that additional money, right, that money doesn't go to the next person as income, and therefore that person can't take some of that money and set it aside in savings, as the marginal propensity to consume would dictate that they would do. So Keynes's idea of the paradox of thrift, right, is he's arguing that if you increase savings, which again he said is really natural to do when an economy is entering a recession, he's arguing that it's counterproductive and that it will only decrease aggregate demand. Right? He says, yeah, your savings will increase, okay? But the savings of the person where you would have spent the money, right, theirs is actually going to be a little bit less than it could be, right, because you didn't spend that money. So their savings, their potential savings falls by about the same amount. And so what Keynes is arguing is, look, in aggregate, right, when people save going into a recession, the overall amount of savings in an economy roughly stays about the same. All that happens is that aggregate demand will fall. So Keynes was arguing that, look, when you go into a recession, the natural human tendency to save money and spend less is counterproductive if you're trying to increase aggregate demand. Okay. Now, that was Keynes's view. That was Keynes's idea of the paradox of thrift. Now, in general, as a rule of thumb, it is good to save money when the economy is going into a recession. Again, you want to make sure that you yourself are prepared for tough economic times that might lie ahead. Okay, but Keynes was kind of, his idea, the paradox of thrift, was in aggregate. And there's still some debate today among economists of whether this idea, the paradox of thrift, still holds. But this was an idea of Keynes, and the essence of his idea was that when an economy is falling into a recession, and if people increase their amount of savings, in aggregate, the savings kind of cancel out, and all that happens is that aggregate demand falls, which Keynes would argue was not a good thing going into a recession. So that's Keynes' idea of the paradox of thrift.